Hello, my name is Stephen Dunn. I'm the author and creator of How to Stay Christendom, and I just want to continue the Soren Kierkegaard lecture series with this second lecture now on fun anecdotes pertaining to Kierkegaard. So I just wanted to do kind of laid-back readings of contemporaries of Kierkegaard, whether it be before or after he died, and just kind of tell some kind of fun stories about his life. So I'll just kind of do some readings and do the second lecture kind of this way. So shouldn't be as intellectually heady or as long as the other videos, so I hope this will just kind of be for personal enjoyment. But to start with the first one, this comes from Troels Frederik Troels Lund, who talks about an account by Kierkegaard's sister, which, to quote it in full, according to his sister's account, this stems from an incident in which he was asked what he would most like to be, and he answered, Kierkegaard, a fork. Why? Well, then I could spear anything I wanted to on the dinner table. His sister replied, but what if we come after you? Then Kierkegaard said, then I'll spear you. The next one comes from another contemporary of Kierkegaard who writes about his schooling with Kierkegaard in his younger days. So he says, Soren was a rather ill-tempered child. He was not well liked by his cousins, who generally fled when he came for a visit with one of his parents. He was not without a certain teasing mischievousness, and this malady developed further when he started attending school, particularly after he became a student at the Borgerdard School, literally the School of Civic Virtue. One of his classmates has told me that Soren's classmates otherwise resented the clever dialectical argumentation with which he triumphed over everyone, and that they therefore decided to give him a spanking. Consequently, one day, when school was over, Soren was forced up onto a table where two of his classmates held him by the arms, two by the legs, and the rest gave his behind a vigorous working over with rulers, book straps, and etc. He thus had first-hand knowledge of what it means to take a beating. So this next reading comes from another contemporary of Kierkegaard, but specifically this was written after he died, somewhere between 1858 and 1866, and it's one of the more better descriptions of Kierkegaard, I think, that I always like to refer to. Specifically, this person says, Kierkegaard's numerous works are like tall trees in literature. High up in the treetops, his monkeys sit and eat from the trees. If you attack them, they throw large Kierkegaardian pieces down at you, rather like monkeys who sit up in coconut palms and throw down nuts if you attack them with stones. If only the Kierkegaardian nuts were not so large and tough that you have a difficult time opening them to get to the relatively small kernel. This next relatively small passage comes from another Kierkegaard, a contemporary of Kierkegaard, who wrote about his exciting experience with hanging out with him, and he wanted to kind of do it again. But Kierkegaard had plans otherwise. So the exchange goes like this. Once I said, that was an excellent outing, only it seemed to me to be too short. I wish I could repeat it. Done, said Kierkegaard. See if the carriage is still there. But the carriage had actually driven off. So Kierkegaard says, then come again tomorrow at so-and-so o'clock. And so I came the next morning. But Kierkegaard said, no, none of that today. But the enjoyment. I'd been looking forward to it. Kierkegaard says, you have had all the enjoyment. Pleasure resides in the imagination. You were happy yesterday evening, you dreamed about it last night, you were happy this morning, and your way over here. Hence, you have had enjoyment enough. Another passage comes from one of his friends, Hans Brockner, who recollects a certain account of Kierkegaard. He writes, at the beginning of the 40s, Kierkegaard took a trip to his father's birthplace on the west coast of Jutland. He told me a typical little incident from that trip. He was in his family's native town, where his late father had established a generous endowment for a school. He had been received with great respect, and the schoolteacher in particular had been busy in his official capacity. Quote, I was really afraid they would erect a triumphal arch for me, he said. When he was ready to depart, he drove past the school. There stood the schoolteacher with all the children lined up to sing a song the schoolteacher had written in Kierkegaard's honor. The teacher, who was to direct the song, had a copy in his hand and was just about to give the signal to begin when Kierkegaard's carriage came to a stop next to him. S.K. leaned over with his friendliest smile and took the copy from his hand, if to read it through, and at the same moment gave the driver to sign to drive on. At this time, the whole arrangement fell apart. The teacher, who didn't know his poem by heart, could not get the song started. So the children then stood silent and surprised, and Kierkegaard rolled down the road, nodding and waving, inwardly amused at the teacher's disappointment. This next passage comes from another contemporary of Kierkegaard, even though on kind of the one hand he tends to speak kind of affectionately about him, but on the one hand kind of disparagingly. So I'll kind of read it here. This was in the 1830s, that is 20 years before the final great explosion took place. In the meanwhile, I became a pastor, and when I met Kierkegaard on the street during a visit to Copenhagen, he took me by the arm and followed along with me, as was his custom with everyone. But I sensed that he was only wanting to pump me and experiment with me psychologically, even though I never had happened to me what was said to have happened to the man who had stood by the railing at the customs office, staring darkly down into the water. Kierkegaard stood next to this person, a stranger to him, and came closer and closer to him, with the notion that the man was contemplating jumping off and ending it all. The experimenting psychologist wanted to read the man's face in order to see how the idea of suicide expressed itself there, in order to see how a person looked at such a decisive moment. The stranger, who had never contemplated doing anything of the sort, noticing this, and tiring of being the object of that investigative gaze, suddenly turned and asked, quote, "Mr. Magister, what did you mean when you wrote that it's a blessing to have corns?" Kierkegaard said, "I'll tell you." And he took the man by the arm and walked with him to the streets of the city, lecturing and gesticulating. Furthermore, this individual who wrote this same passage goes on to say, the questions Kierkegaard raised, quote, "The Christian testimonies given in our time, are they true or not? Is this a faded-out Christianity that now asks to be accepted as the complete and pure preaching, but that wants to fool not only human beings, but also God himself? Are we pastors hirelings, or can we, despite feebleness, measure up to the comparison to honest witnesses to the truth?" I couldn't shake off these questions, but had to subject my entire spiritual posture to renewed testing. And I will not deny that I had to fight my way through no minor scruples in order to obtain light and cheerfulness. Then, as if in a vision, I saw our Lord Jesus standing on the mountain crying over Jerusalem and the sinners in the city. And next to him I saw Kierkegaard, standing and laughing at all of us, condemning us to the abyss of hell, because that is obviously what he did. Then I was struck with the irrefutable certainty that these two could not be in agreement, and that there must be a huge distance between them. And then I immediately emerged from my melancholy thoughts. He was a strange mixture of belief and unbelief. He was, as I have previously called him, a spiritual bachelor, without hearth or home, a bird of the spirit without a nest. And naturally, there could be no offspring from this bachelor. This nestless bird could not hatch a flock to sing to the Lord with childlike sweetness. This next passage again comes from Hans Brockner and isn't really too funny, but kind of has like a wholesome lightheartedness to it. But just to read it in full, he says, quote, "There's a comical recollection related to one of these evening walks. When we returned from the gardens to the alley and had to pass between the posts that mark the end of the path between the trees, it turned out that the post had just been painted. Kierkegaard did not notice this and placed his hand on them for support as he passed between them. He noticed that his hand was covered with paint, and he made a whole series of unsuccessful attempts to wash the paint off by rubbing his hands on the leaves, which dangled down from the trees and were damp with dew, all the while continuing his conversation and keeping his indispensable cane under his arm. His efforts called forth many smiles on the lips of the passerby." This next passage also comes from Hans Brockner, and again isn't like the funniest thing in the world, but is kind of the sort of spirit of humor that Kierkegaard often brought with his friends whenever especially they were trying to have serious conversations with him. So Hans Brockner says, "I did not conceal from Kierkegaard my differences with him concerning Christianity, but we did not argue about them. There was so very much about which we were in sympathy, and I preferred to be taught by him about a great many things of great importance to me, rather than to carry on a discussion in which he could easily have overwhelmed me with his superiority, but could not easily have convinced me. He did most of the communicating in our conversations, and I viewed this as evidence that he was well disposed toward me. He had two modes of conversing. The one was essentially communicative, stimulating, encouraging. The other was questioning, making use of irony, and by means of his dialectics, confounding. He never employed this latter mode against me. Occasionally, when I became zealous, he might throw in a jesting, teasing word. Thus I once spoke quite zealously about how no positive religion could be tolerant, precisely because, with its claim to be revealed religion, it must insist that it is the only true religion, and it would have to consign the others to untruth. So from the point of view from positive religion, a general religiousness, a religion in general, must therefore be a non-entity. As I eagerly developed this idea, I happened to repeat the expression a religion in general, and adopted as my principle that a religion, i.e. a positive religion, in general is a non-entity. Kierkegaard says, yes, and so is a bedpan in general, thus putting a damper on my zeal. That, however, is the only teasing of that sort that I remember from Kierkegaard. He never tried to refute my defiant beliefs directly, but always displayed a completely amicable interest in me, which I remember gratefully. The only reason I could find for this was because that he knew that I was honestly and seriously labored with the cause, which was to him the most important thing of all, and that I was so familiar with what he had written on this and with his whole manner of thinking, that I had sufficient premises to reach a conclusion and would not be brought closer to it by another person, but only absolutely only by myself. So this next and last anecdote, of course, again comes from his friend Hans Bachner regarding a certain exchange that Kierkegaard had with Queen Caroline Amalie, who Kierkegaard appreciated and was friends with, but didn't really care for because she was a little unintelligent. And one time she approached him in a conversation trying to talk a little bit more about his book, which she incorrectly titled as Either and Or. So this sort of exchange takes place where Bachner sort of notices Kierkegaard's disposition towards her. So anyway, he says, when I think of Grundtvig, which is a certain contemporary also of Kierkegaard, I'm reminded of a little anecdote about Kierkegaard. The patroness of Grundtvigianism, the Dowager Queen Caroline Amalie, also set great store by Kierkegaard, at least before his attack on Münster. So SK was evidently not insensitive to the Queen's favor. One day when I was walking with him on the lover's path, he suddenly exclaimed, "Oh, damn it, now I can't escape." I stared at him in amazement, he, a man who otherwise never used words that resembled an oath. I looked up the path, and there, at a considerable distance, I espied a red-liveried servant preceded by two ladies. One of these was the Dowager Queen who, when we met her, very graciously stopped SK and spoke with him. When he saw her, we were so far away from her that we could easily have turned back without having been noticed. I got the impression that his outburst was really not sincerely meant. His "oh damn it" was so unlike him and came out rather forced, as if strong language were being used to hide a sense of satisfaction with what was happening. SK's old traditional veneration for royal authority was not unimportant in his relationship to the Dowager Queen.